Welcome to the debate. We are engaging today with one of the most fundamental questions, really, in political philosophy, the relationship between governmental structure and global stability. Specifically, we're asking, does liberal democracy inherently serve as a, let's say, more reliable guarantor of national and international peace than strong, centralized authoritarian rule? My position, well, it rests on the conviction that history demonstrates that authoritarianism is intrinsically destructive. It has to rely on external conflict and internal repression, whereas democracy, despite its manifest errors, its flaws, provides the only necessary non-coercive framework for lasting stability.
Okay, but I must challenge that premise. The idea that democracy provides any inherently reliable framework for stability, especially when we consider its systemic flaws. I come at this issue from, well, a different starting point. I'd argue that the inherent weaknesses and, frankly, the profound failure of liberal democracies to address deep popular uncertainty that often creates the very vacuum of frustration, the kind that makes the strong man's promise of total order and monolithic unity seem profoundly appealing. The vulnerability lies less in the brute force of the autocrat, perhaps, and more in the inertia, the perceived weakness of the democratic structure itself.
Well, my argument rests on a simple structural premise. Authoritarianism is, by its very nature, geared toward aggression and conquest, not peace. When we really dissect the philosophical core of these regimes, systems historically labeled as fascist, for instance, the organizing principle is often pure entitlement. The nation feels entitled to take what it wants simply because it possesses the will and, well, the capacity to do so. This worldview actively, fundamentally eliminates any basis for trust or friendship or stable, negotiated international relations. If entitlement replaces legality and mutual respect, conflict becomes not just an unfortunate outcome, but an inevitable mechanism of the state itself. Furthermore, internally, these systems require, fundamental deceit to survive, which makes any domestic stability purely illusory. We look back at Hitler, for example, who simultaneously gave these solemn assurances to the world that German rearming was strictly for defense, not, quote, warlike attack, even as his every action prepared for territorial expansion. This internal commitment to falsehood is absolutely essential because the authoritarian system is fundamentally hostile to freedom and to creativity. The suppression of the arts, for instance, it reflects a deeper internal hostility toward the spontaneous, the self-critical, the evolving nature of a healthy human society. Peace, real peace, it just can't exist where the individual spirit must be continuously suppressed.
That is a compelling argument regarding the aggression inherent in that philosophy of entitlement. I grant you that. But I think you might be focusing too much on the result of the brutality, rather than the conditions that allow it to flourish in the first place. Yes, documented violence is a clear feature of these regimes, but we really need to understand why populations are drawn to them. Democratic systems, especially in their modern form, they really struggle during periods of economic or cultural uncertainty. When the individual feels torn from the warmth and security of a corporate existence and left orphaned and empty in a cold world, as one analysis puts it, they look for immediate, comprehensive answers. Right, and the analysis of populist leaders often shows that when people are afraid, angry, or confused, they're often drawn to leaders who seem strong and wrong, who offer clarity and certainty, however factually incorrect, over those perceived as right and weak, meaning those who present complex, nuanced, and perhaps indecisive solutions. Authoritarianism doesn't just promise order, it offers a powerful sense of total purpose. It can feel like a liberating experience for the frustrated individual to escape what they perceive as a petty and meaningless individual existence by fully dedicating themselves to some monumental cause. This sense of historical mission, this feeling of unification, it can be so psychologically powerful that it actually overrides personal distaste for the regime's barbaric acts.
much like the intense feeling of national unity observed in Germany during the early years of Hitler's rule, for instance.
I see the power of that psychological craving for purpose and belonging, I do. But the core distinction remains, doesn't it? The strongman's unity is forged in perpetual opposition. The very structure of centralized, unconstrained power demands external enemies to maintain its internal ideological purity and coherence. This impulse is just inherently hostile to genuine international peace. Hitler openly recognized the necessity of having a devil figure, didn't he? Once noting that if the Jewish population hadn't existed, he would have needed to invent them, simply to have a tangible enemy upon which to focus the collective identity and, well, the anger of the mass movement. And this need for relentless ideological enforcement, it defines these regimes. When we look at North Korea, for example, a system often academically categorized as a form of totalitarian fascism due to its extreme nationalism, personality cult, reliance on militarism, and the Juche ideology, we see a state that relies absolutely on ideological loyalty enforced through severe consequences for any deviation. The cost to humanity in such a system is immeasurable, precisely because identity is forged through the continuous opposition to an external foe or indeed an internal dissident. Peace simply cannot be sustained when its foundation is the creation of this kind of superorganism of control that demands ceaseless struggle.
Okay, but I'm not entirely convinced that the need for a scapegoat is exclusive to these non-democratic systems. Contemporary liberal systems, too, can breed intense internal division and an us versus them mentality. Often this happens precisely because they fail to solve endemic problems that afflict a large portion of the population. When democratic institutions appear incapable of reversing sinking wages, or dealing with outsourcing, or addressing technological displacement, they create a real crisis of legitimacy. And this failure creates the vacuum you mentioned, allowing the demagogue to step right in. They use simple, emotionally satisfying answers and scapegoating, blaming refugees or migrants or external trade partners for deep structural failures. The division arguably is already there, nurtured by democratic inaction and economic anxiety. The populist strongman merely exploits it, often in a way that feels quite empowering to the individual. We've seen figures like Berlusconi, for example, who somehow managed to appear both accessible and remote, making people feel good about breaking norms and rules, which further erodes the consensus required for democratic stability. If democracy can't deliver stability, the psychological turn toward the man who promises easy targets feels almost, well, inevitable sometimes.
The exploitation of division, however, it relies profoundly on a mechanism that actively destroys the basis for reasoned, peaceful coexistence. And that's the systematic assault on shared reality. Genuine, peaceful negotiation, persuasion, it requires dialogue free from coercion and, crucially, based on shared facts. Authoritarianism weaponizes information, destroying the very basis for that kind of rational exchange. We've seen this refined into, well, almost an art form recently. The tactic of flooding the zone with lies, creating such a massive volume of contradictory, false, and often outlandish claims that the public simply loses the capacity to distinguish truth from fiction, is, in my view, perhaps the single greatest propaganda innovation since the classic techniques perfected by, say, Goebbels. It's not just lying, it's an active strategy of informational saturation, designed specifically to detach people from reality for political gain. It makes them cynical, demoralized, and once you eliminate that shared context, you eliminate the possibility of non-coercive social cooperation, making true peace impossible.
Right. While I certainly share your alarm over that detachment from reality, I think the threat posed by advanced authoritarianism might be even more sinister than just cynicism induced by informational chaos. The destruction of truth is central, absolutely, but authoritarian systems don't simply reject intellectual rigor or rational discourse. They often co-opt it, and that makes the resulting control far more total and profound than just simple political deceit. Consider historical communist regimes, for instance. The intellectual class wasn't universally suppressed. Instead, they often became, as one thinker put it, the most formidable taskmaster in history. They were the indispensable superior civil servants, utilizing the very tools of critical thought and intellectual capacity, but twisting them into coercive instruments. Terror was often used to extract faith, forcing a response that should really only be obtained through the most perfect, uncoerced persuasion. The danger here is the perversion of knowledge, the perversion of intellectual capacity into a tool of total state control. That leads to a profound, coercive form of stability, yes, but one based on coerced conviction rather than mere political disagreement.
But let's be very clear about the nature of the order achieved through that co-option and coercion. The peace provided by an authoritarian system is, well, pathological. It's order at the expense of human dignity. We have concrete evidence of this, like the observation that the lowest crime rate in Germany under Hitler came about only because concentration camps like Dachau effectively made the streets safe at night by removing dissidents, criminals, anyone deemed undesirable entirely. That is an imposed order enforced by systemic brutality, not genuine peace stemming from societal cohesion and agreement. It's a chilling example. The cost of this imposed order, whether we look at historical fascism or contemporary totalitarian systems, is the continuous suppression of the individual self and the elimination of any capacity for self-criticism within the state. When the state eliminates the possibility for internal correction, it basically guarantees its own continued violence. That suppression of human freedom is intrinsically a form of internal warfare, not peace.
I absolutely concede that the resulting peace is fundamentally coercive and, yes, morally bankrupt. But we have to return to the structural limitations of liberal democracy that leave this violent alternative looking so appealing to some. The fundamental problem often stems from the perceived or perhaps real incapacity of the existing democratic structure to inspire confidence and manage complexity effectively. Look at institutions like parliaments in many contemporary democracies. They're widely criticized, aren't they, for having lost prestige and, maybe more importantly, for lacking, quote, programs of a scope adequate to the effective capacities that life has come to acquire in the modern individual. When people perceive democratic institutions as weak, slow, bureaucratic, unable to manage the immense power and complexity of modern life, when they feel their government is just treading water, they start looking for alternatives that promise decisive, total action. Nationalism, which often drives modern authoritarian movements, like the focus on bloodlines over borderlines seen in Orban's Hungary, for example, acts as a powerful, maybe regressive, but intensely appealing blind alley. Why? Because it generates a sense of worth and belonging that the perceived inertia of liberal institutions just can't seem to deliver anymore. The crisis, I'd argue, is often one of democratic efficacy.
So, to summarize my position then, the historical record, I believe, strongly supports the view that centralized, unconstrained power views international conflict and severe internal repression not as failures, but as necessary tools for its own self-perpetuation. The foundational requirement of suppressing the free, critical individual is inherently violent. It makes genuine, lasting domestic and international peace simply impossible under such systems. The liberal framework, for all its acknowledged slowness and complexity, is still the only system fundamentally designed around non-coercive negotiation and constructive social cooperation. And that, I'd argue, is the very definition of true stability.
And I would conclude that while liberal democracy is undeniably the better theoretical ideal for individual freedom, its repeated institutional failures, its failure to generate self-confidence, purpose, and decisive solutions for the average person, coupled with its perceived inertia, creates a dangerous moral and political vacuum. The immense appeal of authoritarianism, at least initially, lies not in its documented brutality, which people often rationalize away, but in its powerful ability to generate an illusion of unity, strength, and decisive action precisely when the democratic alternative appears weak and indecisive. So the real challenge for stability and peace isn't just resisting the strong man, it's reforming and strengthening the democratic structure itself, making it robust, compelling, and effective enough to counter the strong man's cynical play.
Ultimately, both systems present immense complexities when we analyze them against the criteria of peace and stability. There are no easy answers here, and we must continue to explore and reflect deeply upon the underlying societal needs, the anxieties, the desires that drive populations toward either the sometimes difficult freedom of self-governance or the perceived security of total authority.
Well said. Thank you. 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 Thank you.